morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to a word on cybersecurity for the week of April 24th, 2022. I'm Kurt Franklin, Senior Analyst at Omdia, and I'm your host for this episode, and well, to be brutally honest, for pretty much every episode. And I'm glad you're here. Whether you're joining me live on LinkedIn, seeing a recorded version on LinkedIn, or checking me out on one of our other outlets like YouTube, I'm glad you're here. And I hope that you'll find a way to make this part of your regular weekly viewing. If you don't know, on LinkedIn, where this is originally broadcast, I have a comment section. And one of the things I would love to know is your choice for a word that best sums up this week in cybersecurity. You know, this has been an interesting week. Again, like last week, we didn't have some sort of massive cybersecurity breach. There was nothing that hit the news saying that tens or hundreds of millions of identities have been stolen, nothing like that. It was kind of run of the mill stuff. You know, we had a couple of fairly large DDoS attacks, including one that was an HTTPS DDoS attack. Had some 0 days, had the standard array of breaches and attacks, had the continuing cyber war to go along with the in real life shooting war in Ukraine. But nothing that was a single event that defined the week. And we're going to call that a good thing, because those single events tend to be pretty catastrophic. So, what did define the week? Well, one of the things that I found interesting in going around and looking at the activity during the week is a continuing look at what's happening in the cyber warfare space in Ukraine. And there are two things that are very critical. One, from the Russian side, the attacks that they have been making on critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and that's everything from access to the internet, to power generation, to energy transfer, to basic communications between military forces and their commanders, or between civilians and the government, have been far less effective than many people assumed they would be. I know early on in this conflict, in this war, there was the assumption that the Russian APT groups would pretty much have their way with Ukraine, that this was going to be one where there was an overwhelming weight of force and talent that would be brought to bear against Ukraine, and that they would basically go dark and silent pretty quickly. That hasn't happened. Been a lot of reasons for that. Among them, that other forces, other allies, have provided backup. A great example is in the Starlink terminals that were sent by the thousands to Ukraine to enable them to continue to have internet access, even though some of the more normal forms of internet access were knocked out. That thwarted a particular effort. Another is that Ukraine has basically had 8 years to prepare for this. You know, I remember back with the Y2K issue, technologists and IT specialists started raising the alarm about what could happen with the date issues. And this involved mainly 2-digit date fields. When they've clicked over from 99 in 1999 at the stroke of midnight on December 31st and became 00. If you had things that looked at dates as always being an ascending number, suddenly things could break. There were about 6 years of effort that went into finding these situations and fixing them. And I will tell you, in a lot of cases, especially with mainframe and IoT, although we weren't really calling it IoT at the time, code, changing from a 2-digit date field to a 4-digit date field was non-trivial. This could require whole scale rewriting of code. But it was done. Now, even though I know of a number of companies that had human beings with analog radios standing by critical infrastructure sites on New Year's Eve, 1999, there wasn't a great deal of disaster. Now, many people looked at this and said, see, you were overblowing the danger all along. I don't think that's correct. I think there was a significant risk, but I think that the risk was recognized early and was dealt with appropriately. Well, a lot of that has happened in 8 years in Ukraine when Russia invaded Crimea. Many in Ukraine saw this as a wake-up call that the same sort of thing could happen with the rest of the country, and so they began preparing. That includes the IT folks. And they have done a pretty good job of making sure that critical infrastructure was, in fact, protected. Now, the other side of this is from the Ukraine side, and they have used social media very effectively as a propaganda tool. They have used social media and the internet as a whole very effectively as a way of communicating between citizens and government, between citizens through government to military, and through the internet between citizens and the government to the rest of the world. Now, some of these are controversial. The idea of using facial recognition software to go in and identify the bodies of dead Russian soldiers and then notify their families of where they are, that is not seen as a universal good. There are many people who have questions about this, and not only within Russia. This is the sort of thing that in a, let's call it classical war, and a classical war that's just between two military forces, that sort of thing would be deeply frowned upon. This is anything but a classical war. And I think it's time to recognize that that sort of classical war may well be an outdated concept. But the overall thrust is clear. From a military and propaganda perspective, this has not been the overwhelming victory for Russia that many anticipated it would be. It also brings about one of the things that I'm going to wrap up in my word for the week. We'll get back to that shortly. Now, another thing that we have seen is a recognition that ransomware continues to be a huge issue. Now, a lot of people thought that ransomware was going to necessarily decline as defenders got better at decrypting the encrypted files that were the heart of ransomware, and to be honest, still are. Instead, the criminals altered their tactics and began using what's called a blended attack. Now, blended attack is essentially just any attack that uses more than one tactic to wage a campaign. It can be anything from a DDoS attack that distracts from a data exfiltration attempt to what's going on with ransomware, where in many cases, before the encryption begins and the demand for ransom is placed, data is exfiltrated. That's a fancy IT word for stolen, with the promise that if the victim tries to decrypt the files themselves and is successful, the attacker will still release confidential information to the world in an extortion attempt. So basically, the victim can pay to stop an extortion attempt and a ransomware attack, or it can just pay to stop the extortion attempt. The fee is about the same. The idea is that one way or another, the attacker is going to get their money. It's interesting because one of the things that is very true about ransomware is that it's what's called a noisy attack. In other words, once the ransomware call for ransom has been made, the victim is fully aware that they have been attacked. Their stealth is out the window. This is full in your face. You're being mugged. Most data exfiltration, most reconnaissance, most attacks that seek to do damage to a system depend on being very quiet. They don't want the victim to know that they're there. This increases what's called the dwell time. Now, dwell time is the period that elapses between when an attack is successful, in other words, when they succeed in getting into an environment, and when the victim becomes aware that they're in the environment. Now, there are a lot of tools out there that try to make that dwell time as short as possible. But in reality, if you look at industry averages, dwell times today are still frequently measured in weeks or months rather than minutes or hours. And it's in those weeks and months that the attackers can do their greatest damage, because they can take data out of the victim's environment a little bit at a time, very quietly, so that it gets buried in all of the email and web traffic and all the other data that's flowing in and out of an organization. It's kind of like the old thing about the IT people who figured out that they could skim the round off error in banking. You know, many of the transactions that go on in banking don't result in a whole penny as the result. They're fractions of a cent that tend to get rounded up or rounded down. Well, if you always round down on the bank's ledger, but round up on a private ledger, well, over the course of a day, you've got lots and lots of fractional cents that can add up to real money over time. Well, if you do the same sort of thing with data, you can gradually take out quite a lot of data a little bit at a time. And only after you have enough to do real damage in an extortion attempt do you go to the noisy part of the attack and begin encrypting files and make a demand for ransom. No, decreasing dwell time is one of those things that is absolutely critical. One of the ways that the attackers boost their dwell time is by getting into a system using novel means. Now, if this is a means that has never been seen before, say something that has never been even recognized as a vulnerability, in the industry, it's called a 0-day. That means that the day that the attack is launched is the first day anyone is aware that this particular type of attack is possible. There's no defense, there's no patch, nothing. Is 0-day is day zero to the process of finding a solution. The attackers, the bad guys of the world, have teams actively searching for these 0 days. And in the interest of full disclosure, government surveillance groups are constantly looking for 0 days as well. When they find a 0 day, they generally don't use it instantly. They bank it until something comes up. There is a need that is so critical that they're willing to burn a 0 day, use a 0 day that's never been used, f- with the full knowledge that once it's used, it will be a very short time before a patch is available or a remediation is available or a countermeasure of some sort is available that makes it far less valuable as an attack mechanism. 2021 was a year when we saw lots of 0 days being used, and it was an atypically high number of 0 days. Why was this? Was it because the bad guys were just out there spending with wild abandon? No. In fact, it's possible that more 0 days weren't being used. It's possible that we've just become better at picking up when 0 days are used. It's also quite possible that we have become far better at defending against the more traditional attacks, requiring 0 days for a successful attack. I apologize. I'm going to scratch an itch that's driving me crazy. Much better. Now, when 0 days are used, typically you will see other bad guy groups, other threat actors using them pretty rapidly, trying to get as much value as they can out of this before patches are available. But what we're seeing now is that organizations are using these in an attempt to be able to do things like exfiltrate data so that they can use it in extortion attempts, so that they can have these complete data sets that can be used in financial fraud. It's something that we need to be aware of, and we need to do things like keep on top of the activity that's happening within our organizations so that when the inevitable breach does occur, the dwell time is not measured in months. If we can measure dwell time in minutes or hours rather than weeks or months, we significantly limit the damage that can be done during any given attack. So that's critical. Now, we're getting down to the point where it's about time for me to talk about what my word is. And I want to do that and let you know that my word is really one that describes much of the essence of cyber warfare. My word for this week is asymmetrical. Asymmetrical warfare is one where there is a vast difference in the size, armament, or capability between the two parties involved. In a traditional human space asymmetrical warfare, that's usually what's used to describe guerrilla warfare, where people with IEDs, improvised explosive devices, are going against armored divisions. When people with Molotov cocktails are going against people with grenades. Or when a small band is making use of terrain and a friendly environment to try and even the odds against a vastly larger traditional military force. What does this mean in cyber security terms? It typically means that the size of the group attacking is much less than the size of the group defending. It typically means that the knowledge of an infrastructure on one side is different than the knowledge of the infrastructure from the other side. And here's where the tables can flip, because you would typically think that if I am an IP person with organization X, that because I installed, purchased, manage the IT infrastructure, the network, the application servers, the endpoints, all that, that I'm going to have a vastly superior knowledge of what is in that infrastructure than any attacker would have. It's a great theory. I'll even say it's the way things should work. But in all too many cases, the advantage in knowledge of the infrastructure on the ground goes to the attacker. Why is this? Attackers, one of the first steps in an attack, and here, if you've never looked at the MITRE attack framework, I'm going to say go out, mitre.org, mitre.org, ATT and ampersand, CK. It describes the process of cybersecurity attacks. And one of the early ones is reconnaissance. It's where the attacker will try to understand the infrastructure that they are about to attack. And many organizations can spend days, weeks, months in reconnaissance before they ever launch an actual attack. That time will typically give those attackers a very good understanding of how the infrastructure exists today. What the defenders often have is an understanding of the infrastructure as it was designed and perhaps as it existed on the day it was deployed. What they frequently have a poor understanding of is the infrastructure as it exists today. Why is that, you say? Don't they know everything that's going on in their infrastructure? Why, no. No, they really don't. And this is especially true in an era when two things are happening. One, we've gone to the bring your own device. So there are going to be a fair number of employee-owned devices, whether they be smartphones, tablets, or laptop computers floating around on a network. The other thing that has happened is cloud services and SaaS, or software as a service. There are many of these services, many of these capabilities that are inexpensive enough to be purchased by an individual business unit or even an individual employee and put on their expense account. It's on a monthly basis, small enough that it floats below the trigger points of various auditing committees and auditors within the organization. That means that all of a sudden you've got data flowing in and out of the organization to these cloud services. You've got data flowing in and out of the organization to and from endpoint devices that you didn't deploy. This can all add up to huge changes in an organization's infrastructure that are not reflected on any network map, not reflected on any diagram of the application delivery network. Now, there are plenty of solutions to this. One of them is the blanket prohibition on external devices, the blanket prohibition on external cloud services and software as a service. Now, this is a solution that you see used in places like military and high security installations. This is the sort of solution that you will frequently see deployed in financial services when we're working with very large sums of fungible tokens. fungible assets, things that can be easily converted one to another. What you have trouble with is deploying that kind of security in most other situations. Why? Because the employees resent it. The employees will fight back. The employees will find ways around it. And so in those cases, IT is left with things like deploying systems that constantly go out and scan the network for devices, constantly go out and scan the network for new services and new cloud applications, and consistently add those to the inventory and add them to the list of things that security and IT can go out to whoever has brought them into the network and say, let's talk about this and make sure it's done in the proper way. Asymmetry is very powerful. In some cases, it's a definite good. When technology allows a small company to have the same sort of IT advantages often enjoyed by large companies, that can be seen as a great thing. We have now cloud-based ERP systems that allow very small organizations to take advantage of ERP services that once were the sole provenance of giant organizations that could afford programs like SAP and Oracle, along with the consultants to deploy and configure them. But when the asymmetry allows a dedicated criminal, a small team of dedicated criminals, to act against large organizations or against large bodies of individuals, it's not such a good thing. The question is, how do we protect against one while encouraging the other? Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that asymmetrical attacks often succeed because the attacker, the threat actor, has a way of thinking about a problem that is different than those on the defensive side. Here I'm going to make a case for diversity in your IT and especially in your cybersecurity workforce. This is not just a feel-good thing, although you should feel good if you have a diverse workforce. This is bringing a diversity of thought, a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of life experiences to the process of defending the cybersecurity or the cyber assets of an organization. You need to have that diversity so that it is more difficult for you to be surprised by an individual threat actor using unique thought patterns. The more diverse your body of experience, the more diverse your way of thinking about attackers, the greater the likelihood that you'll be on the lookout for novel attacks. The more you will be able to defend against them and to recognize them when they've been successful and reduce your dwell time. Asymmetry. It's a cool word, cool concept, as long as you're not on the receiving end of some very effective asymmetrical warfare. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of A Word on Cybersecurity. I'm here every Friday, give or take, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope you'll join me. If you're not able to join me at that time, thank you for watching a recorded version. You'll find this on LinkedIn in an on-demand version just as soon as the recording finishes, and on both my YouTube channel and Omdia Cyber's YouTube channel on the Monday following an episode. What will next week's word be? Have no idea. Leave me a message, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Until then, I'm Kurt Franklin, Senior Analyst at Omnia Cybersecurity saying thanks for watching. See you next week.